What if everything you thought about medieval women was completely wrong? What if the tales of helpless damsels and valiant knights from the 11th to the 15th centuries were just one part of a much bigger, more complex story? Number 9. The damsel in distress was always helpless and passive. Many stories paint a picture of medieval women, especially noble ladies, as perpetually waiting. They are often depicted in high towers, perhaps gazing out a narrow window, sighing for a knight to rescue them from a dragon, a wicked lord, or even just boredom. This image, so deeply ingrained in our collective imagination, suggests a life of utter powerlessness, where a woman's existence revolved entirely around being acted upon, never acting herself. Her role in this fantasy was to inspire the hero to be the prize, the fragile flower needing constant protection. She was the one who fainted, who wept, who prayed for deliverance, incapable of much beyond these emotional displays. Her agency seemed limited to offering a favor to a knight or perhaps a tearful farewell before he rode off to glory. This vision simplifies a vast and varied historical reality, reducing complex human beings to archetypes. It suggests a world where a woman's voice was rarely heard outside her personal chambers, where her opinions held little sway, and her actions were almost always directed by men. The damsel in distress, by her very definition, exists to be saved, to be the catalyst for a male hero's quest, and her own story often begins and ends with her rescue. She is the object of desire, of protection, but rarely the subject of her own destiny. The idea that women were always delicate creatures, physically and mentally unequipped for the rigors of life or decision making, forms a core part of this particular historical fantasy. Their primary virtues were seen as beauty, piety, and purity, all qualities that would make them ideal objects of a knight's devotion, but not necessarily active participants in the demanding world of medieval society. Yet, a closer look at the historical record reveals a different narrative, one where medieval women often displayed remarkable resilience, intelligence, and a capacity for decisive action. Take, for instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and influential women of the 12th century. She was no damsel in distress waiting for a knight. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, a vast and wealthy territory. She married King Louis VII of France, and then, after an annulment, married King Henry II of England, making her queen consort of two of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Eleanor actively participated in politics, patronized poets and artists, and even went on the Second Crusade alongside her first husband, traveling all the way to Jerusalem. Her influence was so significant that when she was imprisoned by her second husband, Henry, her absence deeply affected political stability. She played a crucial role in managing her son's affairs, even orchestrating a rebellion against Henry. Her later years saw her acting as regent for her son, Richard the Lionheart, when he was away on the Third Crusade, and she skillfully managed the affairs of England, often traveling across the kingdom to secure her family's power. She was not a passive figure, she was a political force, a woman who commanded respect and wielded considerable power. Another example can be found in Melisende, Queen of Jerusalem in the 12th century. She ruled as queen regnant for many years, first alongside her husband, Fulk, and then independently. She was a shrewd political operator navigating the complex and dangerous politics of the Crusader states. She made alliances, oversaw construction projects, and patronized religious institutions and artists. Melisende was deeply involved in the governance of her kingdom, making decisions that affected the lives of thousands. Her authority was not merely ceremonial, it was real and exercised with vigor. When her son Baldwin III sought to usurp her power, she fiercely defended her right to rule, leading to a temporary division of the kingdom before a reconciliation. She was a warrior queen in the sense that she fought for her position and her family's legacy, not a woman waiting meekly for rescue. Beyond queens and duchesses, women in less exalted positions also demonstrated significant agency. Widows, for example, often gained considerable legal and economic freedom upon their husbands' deaths. They could inherit property, manage businesses, and even represent themselves in court. Marjorie Kempe, a laywoman from the 14th century, stands out as an extraordinary example. She dictated her autobiography, one of the earliest known in the English language, detailing her spiritual journey, her travels across Europe to holy sites, and her struggles with her family and the church authorities. Marjorie was outspoken, unconventional, and determined, constantly challenging social norms and religious expectations. She was not a figure who waited silently. She actively pursued her beliefs and made her voice heard. Even within the framework of warfare, often seen as a male domain, women sometimes took active roles. While direct combat was rare for women, they often defended castles during sieges. Countess Jeanne of Flanders, for instance, famously led the defense of her castle during a siege in the 13th century, inspiring her troops and holding out against attackers for an extended period. Women were also crucial in the logistical support of armies, providing supplies, nursing the wounded, and managing the estates that funded military campaigns. They were not just passive victims of war, they were integral to its operations and consequences. The notion of the damsel in distress, while a compelling literary trope, fails to capture the multifaceted reality of medieval women who, through their actions, defied passive expectations and actively shaped their own lives and the world around them. Their strength, cunning, and endurance were often hidden beneath historical narratives that preferred simpler, more romanticized portrayals. Number 8, courtly love was always purely chaste and spiritual. The romanticized vision of courtly love often portrays it as an ethereal, almost religious devotion. In this popular fantasy, a knight pledges himself to a noble lady, revering her from afar with an idealized, pure affection. The love is not meant to be physical, it is a spiritual quest, a journey of moral and personal improvement for the knight, inspired by the lady's unattainable perfection. The lady, in turn, is seen as a beacon of virtue, existing on a pedestal, inspiring the knight to great deeds of valor and chivalry. Their connection is one of souls, a profound respect that transcends earthly desires. The knight might wear her favor in battle, write her poems, or undertake dangerous quests in her name, but always with the understanding that the love is unconsummated, a symbolic bond that elevates both parties to a higher plane of existence. The focus is on the knight's service, his adoration, and the lady's remote, inspiring presence. This perception often draws heavily from the more theological or philosophical interpretations of courtly love, where the human love was seen as a stepping stone to a greater divine love. It emphasizes the concept of fine amour, a refined love that purifies the lover and ennobles the beloved, keeping both parties in a state of grace and elevated moral conduct. This vision completely sidesteps any notion of earthly desires, focusing instead on the sublime, the symbolic, and the strictly platonic. However, historical and literary evidence from the medieval period paints a much more nuanced, and at times, earthy picture of courtly love. While the ideals of chastity and spiritual elevation were certainly present in some expressions of courtly love, the reality was often far more complex, sometimes involving intense passion, adultery, and even scandalous affairs. The troubadours of Occitania, in what is now southern France, were key figures in developing the concept of courtly love in the 11th and 12th centuries. Their poems, while often praising the lady's beauty and virtue, also frequently hinted at a desire for physical intimacy. Some troubadour songs, known as cansos, contain explicit pleas for a lady's mercy or grace, which could sometimes imply sexual favors, not just a kind glance or an encouraging word. Poets like Bernard de Ventadorn, for instance, sang about his longing for a lady's touch, describing her physical attributes with considerable detail. The emotional intensity in these poems often veered beyond mere adoration, expressing a passionate yearning that was far from purely spiritual. Marie de Champagne, daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, presided over one of the most famous courts of love in the late 12th century. It was there that Andreas Capellanus, or Andrew the Chaplain, wrote his highly influential work, De Amore, or The Art of Courtly Love. This treatise, often seen as a foundational text for courtly love, contains dialogues and judgments on various love cases, some of which are surprisingly explicit about the nature of love and its physical aspects. Capellanus discusses rules for lovers, including the idea that true love cannot exist between husband and wife, suggesting that the forbidden nature of the love, often involving an adulterous relationship, was a core component of its appeal. While Capellanus' work might have been satirical or didactic, it certainly acknowledges the physical dimension of courtly love, even if to complicate it with moral or social rules. The fact that the rules for courtly love debated situations involving kisses, embraces, and clandestine meetings shows that the purely chaste fantasy often overlooks the very human desires at play. The great medieval romances, like the stories of Lancelot and Guinevere or Tristan and Isolde, are prime examples of courtly love relationships that are anything but purely chaste. Lancelot's devotion to Queen Guinevere, while inspiring him to incredible feats of heroism, leads directly to an adulterous affair that ultimately brings down King Arthur's court. Their love, passionate and deeply physical, is at the heart of the tragedy. Similarly, the story of Tristan and Isolde, bound by a magical love potion, depicts a relationship consumed by an irresistible illicit desire that leads to betrayal, exile, and death. These are not tales of platonic adoration, they are stories of powerful, sometimes destructive, passions that disregard social norms and marital vows. The allure of these narratives, then as now, lies precisely in their forbidden, intense nature, not in their spiritual purity. Moreover, in a society where marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons, courtly love could sometimes serve as an outlet for emotional or physical desires that were not met within a formal marriage. While the ideal was perhaps a love that ennobled, the practical application often involved a search for emotional or physical fulfillment outside the confines of the marital bed. The secrecy and danger associated with these illicit relationships, often involving a married lady and her knightly admirer, only added to their romantic appeal. The subtle gestures, the coded language, the clandestine meetings all point to a relationship that was far from a purely intellectual or spiritual exercise. It was a game of desire, risk, and often transgression. So, while the idea of a knight revering his lady from afar is a beautiful one, it is but one facet of a much more complex and often scandalous reality of courtly love, where the lines between adoration and ardent desire were frequently blurred and sometimes entirely erased. Number 7. Knights only fought for their lady's favor. The popular imagination often pictures the medieval knight as a dashing figure, driven solely by the love and favor of his chosen lady. In this vivid fantasy, every blow struck on the battlefield, every joust in the tournament, every perilous quest undertaken, is performed with the lady's image in the knight's heart. He wears her favor, perhaps a ribbon or a piece of cloth, tied to his helmet or arm, a visible sign of his devotion. His prowess in combat is directly linked to her inspiration. Her beauty and virtue are the wellspring of his courage and strength. The ultimate reward for his chivalric deeds is not land or gold, but a smile from his lady, a nod of approval, or perhaps a gentle touch of her hand. This vision simplifies the knight's motivations, reducing a complex individual with diverse loyalties and ambitions to a mere romantic protagonist. It suggests that personal glory, economic gain, or even the survival of his lineage took a backseat to the ethereal reward of a lady's affection. His entire existence in this fantasy is a performance staged for the eyes of his beloved, an endless pursuit of her approval. It is a compelling narrative, one that places romance at the very center of medieval martial culture. However, the historical reality of medieval knighthood was far more pragmatic, rooted in a complex web of feudal obligations, economic necessities, political ambitions, and deeply ingrained social structures. While the concept of courtly love certainly influenced knightly ideals and literature, it was rarely the sole, or even primary, motivator for a knight's actions on the battlefield or in his daily life. Knights were, first and foremost, landowners and warriors. Their status in society was tied to their landholdings, their military service to their lord, and their ability to protect their families and vassals. A knight's primary duty was to his liege lord, to whom he owed military service, often for a specified number of days each year. Failure to fulfill this obligation could result in the loss of his fief, his land, and his social standing. This feudal duty, a binding legal and social contract, was a far more concrete motivator than the abstract concept of a lady's favor. Moreover, the financial realities of knighthood were demanding. Maintaining armor, weapons, horses, and a retinue of squires and servants was incredibly expensive. Participating in wars or tournaments could lead to significant financial gains through ransoms, plunder, or prizes, but it also carried the risk of financial ruin or death. The knights fought for land, for wealth, to expand their lord's territory, or to protect their own. They sought to improve their social standing, to earn a reputation for bravery and skill, and to secure their family's future. These were tangible, immediate concerns that often outweighed the more abstract romantic ideals. A successful campaign could mean more land, more tenants, and a higher income, providing a stable foundation for the knight's descendants. Religious fervor also played a colossal role in motivating knights, particularly during the Crusades. Thousands of knights from all social strata took up the cross and traveled to the Holy Land, driven by deep religious convictions, a desire for salvation, and the promise of spiritual rewards. They fought to reclaim Jerusalem, to defend Christendom, and to earn God's favor, a motivation far exceeding any earthly ladies. Figures like Godfrey of Bouillon or Louis IX of France led crusades motivated by piety and duty to God, not by a particular lady's inspiration. Their devotion was aimed at a higher divine power. The desire for personal honor and reputation was another powerful driver. A knight's reputation for courage, skill, and chivalry was paramount. It determined his standing among his peers, his marriage prospects, and his ability to attract followers. dying bravely in battle, even for a losing cause, was often seen as more honorable than retreating. Tournaments, while often having a romantic veneer, were also fierce competitions where knights sought to prove their martial prowess, win prestige, and gain material rewards. The favor of a lady in such contexts could be a symbolic gesture, but the underlying motivation was often a very real desire for recognition and advancement within the highly competitive knightly class. Consider the reality of medieval warfare. Battles were brutal, chaotic affairs, often involving prolonged sieges, desperate charges, and hand-to-hand combat. In such circumstances, a knight's primary focus was survival, victory, and the protection of his comrades and lord. While the idea of a lady's inspiring presence might have provided a psychological boost, it was the discipline, the training, the loyalty to his banner, and the fear of a painful death that truly shaped his actions. The romantic notion that knights galloped into the fray with only love in their hearts overlooks the grim realities of medieval combat and the multifaceted motivations of the individuals who fought in it. The lady's favor was a beautiful, idealized adornment to the knightly life, but it was rarely the sole, or even the strongest, anchor of a knight's actions. His world was shaped by duty, ambition, and the harsh demands of survival and social standing. Number 6. Love marriages were non-existent and only arranged for money or power. The common belief about medieval marriages often portrays them as cold, calculated transactions. In this widespread fantasy, personal affection or romantic love played no part whatsoever in the decision-making process. Our marriages, particularly among the nobility and wealthy commoners, were purely strategic alliances, meticulously arranged to consolidate land, secure political influence, or forge economic partnerships. Daughters were seen as valuable commodities, their hands offered in exchange for a desirable dowry, a favorable treaty, or a prestigious family connection. Sons were expected to marry for the benefit of their lineage, to expand the family's holdings, or to gain access to powerful networks. The individuals involved, the bride and groom, were presumed to have little to no say in the matter. Their feelings, preferences, or personal inclinations were deemed irrelevant in the grand scheme of dynastic ambition. This narrative suggests a world devoid of emotional bonds within marriage, where affection might exist, but only as a fortunate, unexpected byproduct, never as the initial spark or driving force. It paints a picture of resigned brides and dutiful grooms stepping into lifelong unions dictated by others, with love remaining a whimsical, perhaps even dangerous, foreign concept to the institution of marriage itself. However, historical records reveal a more complex reality where, while arranged marriages were indeed the norm, affection could and often did develop within these unions, and in some rare cases, personal preference might even influence marital choices. While economic and political considerations were paramount, especially for the elite, it is a simplification to say that love was entirely absent. The Church, while emphasizing the procreative and sacramental aspects of marriage, also preached the importance of conjugal affection and mutual respect within the marital bond. Theological texts often discuss the idea of caritas conjugalis, or conjugal charity, a form of love that was expected to grow between husband and wife, distinct from the passionate eros of courtly love. This meant that while marriage might begin as a contract, it was hoped to develop into a relationship of mutual support and companionship. Consider the correspondence between medieval spouses. Letters between husbands and wives, though relatively rare for non-noble classes, sometimes reveal genuine affection and concern. For example, the letters of Abelard and Heloise, though a dramatic and tragic case, speak to a deep, if unconventional, love that existed between them, even after their marriage and subsequent tribulations. While their story is unique, it hints at the capacity for profound emotional connections. Less dramatic, but equally telling, are the letters of King Edward I of England to his wife Eleanor of Castile. These letters, often written during his military campaigns, express fondness, concern for her well-being, and a desire for her company. Edward was famously devoted to Eleanor, and after her death he erected elaborate memorial crosses, known as the Eleanor Crosses, at each place her funeral procession stopped on its way to London. This act of public mourning and remembrance speaks volumes about a personal bond that went beyond political expediency. Even in cases of arranged marriages, the idea of mutual consent, at least symbolically, became increasingly important under canon law. While parents might exert enormous pressure, a marriage could theoretically be annulled if it could be proven that either party truly did not consent. This provided a small, albeit often difficult, avenue for resistance against unwanted unions. There are instances where individuals, especially women, might attempt to resist marriages they found particularly abhorrent. While often unsuccessful, their efforts highlight a desire for agency even within such restrictive systems. Furthermore, among the less affluent classes, particularly peasants and artisans, marriages might have been arranged. But there was often greater flexibility and the potential for personal choice, driven by more localized economic needs rather than grand political schemes. A young man and woman might work together, or their families might find each other's skills complementary, leading to a union where personal familiarity and respect were already present. In guilds, a master artisan might marry his daughter to an apprentice, a pragmatic decision that could also foster a personal bond. It is also important to remember that love itself was understood differently in the medieval period. The intense romantic love we often associate with modern relationships was sometimes viewed with suspicion, as it could disrupt social order or lead to irrational behavior. Love, within marriage, was often understood as respect, loyalty, shared purpose, and a deep partnership in managing a household and raising children. This form of love, while perhaps less dramatic than the passionate courtly ideal, was no less real or significant for the people living it. To assume that medieval people were incapable of forming affectionate bonds within their marriages, simply because those marriages were arranged, is to project modern sensibilities onto a historical period where love manifested in many different, often quieter, ways. The absence of a passionate courtship, as we understand it, did not necessarily mean the absence of a meaningful, loving partnership. Number 5, medieval women held absolutely no power whatsoever. A pervasive fantasy suggests that medieval women were entirely powerless, subjugated figures with no say in their own lives or the world around them. This image portrays them as trapped within the confines of domesticity, or within the rigid structures of male-dominated society, utterly without agency or influence. They are seen as possessions, passed from father to husband, their voices silenced, their opinions disregarded. In this narrative, a woman's sphere was strictly limited to the home, or perhaps the convent, with no possibility of engaging with the wider world of politics, economics, or social decision-making. Their legal rights are imagined as virtually non-existent, their property controlled by men, and their public presence barely acknowledged. This fantasy depicts a society where the mere fact of being female rendered one incapable of holding any meaningful authority or exerting any real impact on historical events. It simplifies the social structures of the time into a stark dichotomy: men with all the power, women with none. However, a closer examination of medieval history reveals numerous instances where women, from queens to commoners, wielded significant power and influence in a variety of spheres. Their power was often exercised differently from men's, sometimes indirectly, but it was undeniably present and consequential. Noblewomen, for instance, frequently managed vast estates in their husband's absence, which could be for prolonged periods due to warfare, crusades, or political service. This involved overseeing agricultural production, managing finances, administering justice to tenants, and supervising a large household. These women were not simply passive homemakers, they were skilled administrators and formidable economic managers. For examples like Matilda of Tuscany in the 11th century, who ruled a vast territory in Italy and was a key player in the investiture controversy, demonstrating military and diplomatic skill, show the heights of power some women achieved. Queen regents were another significant category of powerful women. When a king died, leaving a young heir, his widow often served as regent, effectively ruling the kingdom until her son came of age. This position afforded immense political power, allowing them to make treaties, lead armies, and appoint officials. Blanche of Castile, regent for her son Louis IX of France in the 13th century, is a prime example. She successfully put down rebellions, negotiated peace treaties, and skillfully guided France through a period of political instability, demonstrating remarkable political acumen and strength. Similarly, Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England, actively engineered her husband's overthrow and ruled as regent for her son, Edward III. While her actions were controversial, they undeniably demonstrate her immense power and influence. Beyond the nobility, women in religious orders held significant authority. Abbesses of powerful convents often controlled large landholdings, managed substantial incomes, and wielded considerable spiritual and temporal power. They were patrons of arts and learning, administrators of vast enterprises, and spiritual guides to their communities. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, composer, philosopher, and physician, corresponded with popes and emperors, offered political advice, and founded new monasteries. Her influence extended far beyond the cloister walls, demonstrating intellectual and spiritual authority that commanded respect from the highest echelons of society. In the urban centers, women played vital roles in the economy. They participated in trade, ran businesses, and were active members of craft guilds. While some guilds restricted women, many others welcomed them, especially in trades related to textiles, brewing, baking, and retail. A widow often had the right to continue her deceased husband's business, demonstrating her capacity for independent economic activity. Some women even became masters in their crafts, training apprentices, and managing successful enterprises. The regulations of cities like Paris show women owning shops, paying taxes, and engaging in commercial ventures, demonstrating their economic independence and their contribution to urban life. Even in legal matters, women were not entirely without recourse. So they could initiate lawsuits, defend their rights, and testify in court, particularly concerning property, inheritance, and marriage. While their legal status was often dependent on their marital status, single women and widows generally had more legal rights than married women. The idea that women were entirely without power overlooks these critical roles and responsibilities they held, not just in the domestic sphere, but in the political, economic, and spiritual landscapes of the medieval world. Their power might have been different in form from that of men, but it was real, varied, and had a profound impact on the course of history. Number 4, courtly love was a universal practice, understood by everyone. The widespread fantasy of courtly love often presents it as a uniform, ubiquitous phenomenon that permeated all levels of medieval society. In this view, every knight yearned for a lady, every lady inspired a knight, and the elaborate rituals and expectations of courtly love were a common language understood by all, from the lowliest peasant to the most exalted monarch. It suggests that this particular form of romantic expression was a societal norm, practiced and revered across all regions, social classes, and time periods within the Middle Ages. The intricacies of secret glances, poetic declarations, and acts of chivalry are imagined as a universal script for love, defining romantic relationships for everyone, everywhere. This fantasy simplifies a complex cultural phenomenon, overlooking its specific origins, its limited reach, and its often contested interpretations. It portrays a monolithic medieval Europe where a single, dominant romantic ideal governed all interactions between men and women, assuming a widespread literacy and leisure time that was far from universal. However, historical and literary evidence clearly shows that courtly love was a specific cultural construct, largely confined to aristocratic circles in certain regions of Europe, primarily southern France in the 11th and 12th centuries, before spreading to northern France, England, and other parts of Europe. It was never a universal practice, nor was it understood or embraced by all segments of society. Troubadours, who popularized the concept, operated within wealthy noble courts, and their poetry was composed for an elite audience with the leisure and education to appreciate its nuances. This form of love was an intricate game for the wealthy and the well-educated, not a common sentiment among the broader population. For the vast majority of the population, including peasants, artisans, and most town dwellers, life was dominated by practical concerns: survival, labor, family, and community. Their relationships, including marriage, were driven by economic necessity, social stability, and the demands of agricultural or craft production. A peasant's concept of love would have been rooted in partnership, mutual support, and the raising of children, not in the stylized, often adulterous, and highly intellectualized ideals of courtly love. They would have had little exposure to or understanding of the refined poetry and philosophical debates surrounding courtly love, which were confined to the courts and literary circles of the aristocracy. The daily grind of farming, tending to animals, or producing goods left little room for the elaborate romantic games of the nobility. Even within the aristocracy, courtly love was subject to different interpretations and debates. As seen in works like Andreas Capellanonus' The Amour, there were discussions and disagreements about what constituted true courtly love, whether it could exist within marriage, and what its ultimate purpose was. Some interpreted it as a purely literary exercise, a form of sophisticated entertainment. Others saw it as a path to moral improvement or a justification for illicit affairs. There was no single, universally agreed upon definition or practice. The concept itself evolved over time, becoming more stylized and allegorical in later centuries, moving further from its initial, sometimes scandalous, troubadour roots. Furthermore, the very idea of courtly love is often considered a literary construct, a set of tropes and ideals found in poetry and romance, rather than a direct reflection of widespread romantic practice. While some historical individuals may have attempted to emulate these ideals, it was primarily a cultural phenomenon existing within literature and artistic expression. It provided a framework for social interaction and entertainment within aristocratic courts, but it was not a guidebook for all relationships in medieval Europe. The literary output of the period, while rich in tales of courtly love, represents only a fraction of the actual lived experiences of medieval people. To assume that all relationships mirrored the idealized or dramatic scenarios found in Arthurian romances or troubadour songs is to misunderstand the diverse social realities of the time. The idea that courtly love was a universal language of affection fails to account for the vast differences in social class, education, geography, and the practical demands of everyday life that shaped romantic and marital relationships throughout the medieval period. It was a fascinating, influential cultural movement, but by no means a global or all-encompassing one. Number 3, the noblewoman's life was easy and full of leisure. The popular fantasy about medieval noblewomen often paints a picture of a life of endless leisure, spent in luxurious castles, surrounded by beauty, and engaged in refined pursuits. In this vision, the noble lady passes her days embroidering tapestries, listening to minstrels, entertaining guests, and perhaps strolling in walled gardens, all while being waited on by a retinue of servants. Her life is imagined as one free from the physical labor and daily struggles of the common people, a privileged existence filled with idleness, romance, and artistic appreciation. This fantasy suggests that her primary concerns were social graces, fashion, and perhaps overseeing a few domestic details, with no real burden of responsibility or significant challenges. It implies that her high birth automatically granted her a life of comfort and ease, shielded from the harsh realities that affected most medieval people. The image is one of delicate refinement, where beauty and grace were her main attributes, and her days unfolded in a serene, untroubled rhythm, completely detached from the demands of managing a large estate or facing the dangers of the era. However, the historical reality of a noblewoman's life was far from one of effortless leisure. While certainly privileged compared to peasants, noblewomen, particularly those managing large estates or holding significant social standing, bore immense responsibilities and faced considerable challenges that demanded their active involvement and practical skills. Their lives were often physically demanding, intellectually challenging, and fraught with dangers. Childbearing, for instance, was a constant risk to a noblewoman's life. High infant and maternal mortality rates meant that many women endured multiple pregnancies, often losing children in infancy or dying themselves from complications during childbirth. This was a physical and emotional toll that few modern women can truly comprehend. A noblewoman's primary duty was to produce heirs, especially sons, to ensure the continuation of her husband's lineage. This was not a passive role, but a perilous biological imperative. Beyond childbirth, noblewomen were the primary managers of vast households, which were complex economic and social units. A typical medieval castle or manor was a bustling center of activity, often supporting dozens, if not hundreds, of people, including servants, squires, craftsmen, and sometimes soldiers. The lady of the house was responsible for overseeing the preparation of food, the brewing of ale, the weaving of cloth, and the production of various goods needed for daily life. She supervised the staff, managed the household budget, and ensured that all domestic operations ran smoothly. This required considerable organizational skills, knowledge of accounting, and an understanding of supply chains. She might have overseen gardens that produced food and herbs, or supervised the processing of wool and flax. These were not mere hobbies, but essential managerial tasks vital to the economic well-being of the estate. Many noblewomen were also skilled in medicinal arts, often acting as the primary healers for their household and local community. They had knowledge of herbs, poultices, and traditional remedies, caring for the sick and injured, not just among their family, but also among their tenants and servants. This was a practical, hands-on skill that could literally mean the difference between life and death in an era without modern medicine. Their knowledge was often passed down through generations, making them repositories of vital medical lore. Moreover, a noblewoman's life was often interwoven with political and social responsibilities. She was expected to maintain family alliances, entertain important guests, and represent her husband or family in social gatherings. She might have been responsible for educating her children and sometimes the children of other noble families sent to the household for training. During her husband's frequent absences due to war, tournaments, or travel, she became the de facto lord of the manor, making critical decisions regarding justice, defense, and administration. She might have had to rally defenses during a siege, negotiate with neighboring lords, or oversee agricultural work. These were not activities for the faint of heart or the idle. Even leisure activities like embroidery, while appearing genteel, were often productive. Many tapestries and pieces of needlework were created not just for decoration but to record historical events, teach moral lessons, or demonstrate the wealth and skill of the household. They were often collaborative projects requiring significant effort and time. The idea of a noblewoman's life being one of endless ease and carefree leisure overlooks the very real and demanding responsibilities, the constant dangers, and the significant administrative and practical skills that were essential for their survival and for the prosperity of their families and estates in medieval society. Their high status came with heavy burdens, not just privileges. Number 2, courtly love was only about romantic passion. A common fantasy about courtly love fixates solely on its romantic aspect, portraying it as an all-consuming, idealized romantic passion between a knight and a lady. In this narrow view, the core of courtly love is an intense emotional and sometimes physical longing, a fervent, idealized crush that drives all the actions of the participants. The focus is on the knight's devotion, the lady's beauty, and the powerful, almost overwhelming emotional bond that connects them. Any other dimensions of courtly love are often ignored, as if the entire phenomenon was a straightforward precursor to modern romantic love, centered solely on personal feelings and desires. This perspective simplifies a complex social and literary phenomenon, stripping it of its deeper implications and functions within medieval aristocratic society. It suggests that courtly love was simply about falling deeply in love, much as we understand it today, only with a medieval aesthetic. It overlooks the subtle games, the social maneuvering, and the cultural commentary woven into its very fabric. However, courtly love was far more than just romantic passion. It was a sophisticated social game, a literary exercise, a means of displaying refinement, and often deeply intertwined with power dynamics and social status within aristocratic courts. It functioned as a complex set of behaviors and ideals that served various purposes beyond mere romance. One crucial aspect of courtly love was its role as a form of social display and refinement. For noblemen and women, participating in the rituals of courtly love was a way to demonstrate their cultural sophistication, their education, and their adherence to the latest aristocratic fashions. Knowing the subtle codes of behavior, being able to compose or appreciate intricate poetry, and engaging in witty conversations about love were marks of a cultivated individual. It was a performance, a way to signal one's membership in the elite and demonstrate one's understanding of courtly etiquette. The ability to engage in these elaborate romantic games showcased one's gentility and social standing. Courtly love also functioned as a form of social climbing or patronage. A knight might seek the favor of a powerful noblewoman, not purely for romantic reasons, but because her approval could lead to advancements in his career, access to resources, or a higher standing within the court. Her patronage could secure him lands, titles, or a place in her husband's retinue. Similarly, a lady might use the adoration of her knight to enhance her own prestige, to solidify her position within the court, or to demonstrate her influence. The love could be a polite fiction, a way to establish a mutually beneficial relationship that brought social or political advantages to both parties without necessarily involving deep emotional attachment. The gifts exchanged, the poems composed, and the favors granted could all be part of a broader network of reciprocal obligations and displays of loyalty that were common in feudal society. Moreover, courtly love was a rich source of literary inspiration and entertainment. Troubadour poetry, chansons de geste, and later the Arthurian romances were not just expressions of personal emotion, they were works of art designed to entertain, educate, and provoke thought among their aristocratic audiences. They explored themes of loyalty, betrayal, honor, and suffering, often using the framework of courtly love to tell compelling stories. The conventions of courtly love provided a ready-made set of characters and plot devices for writers, allowing them to explore complex human relationships and societal norms within a popular genre. The literary aspect was so strong that it is sometimes difficult to distinguish between actual practices and the idealized portrayals in literature. Many scholars argue that courtly love was primarily a literary construct, a set of fictional conventions that may or may not have been widely practiced in real life. Finally, courtly love could serve as a means of sublimating potentially disruptive energies within the court. By channeling intense emotions and desires into a highly ritualized, often non-consummated and semi-public performance, it provided an outlet for passions that, if left unchecked, could lead to scandal, conflict, or even violence. It was a controlled environment for exploring forbidden desires, often within the context of adulterous relationships, which, if made public or acted upon recklessly, could have dire consequences. The secrecy and the intellectual games involved in courtly love could serve to contain these passions within acceptable bounds. Therefore, to see courtly love as merely romantic passion is to miss its multifaceted roles as a social strategy, a cultural performance, a literary art form, and a mechanism for managing social dynamics within the medieval elite. It was a sophisticated game with many layers, only one of which was genuine personal affection. Number 1. Medieval women were illiterate and uneducated. The persistent fantasy holds that medieval women, almost without exception, were illiterate and uneducated, confined to a world without books, writing, or intellectual pursuits. This image often depicts them as simple, unlearned figures capable only of managing a household or performing domestic duties, with no access to formal schooling or the broader world of knowledge. Their minds, in this fantasy, are seen as untutored, their capacity for learning limited, and their contributions to intellectual or artistic life virtually non existent. It suggests a time when education was strictly the domain of men, particularly clergy and scholars, and women were deliberately kept in ignorance, their intellectual potential suppressed. This view overlooks the significant roles many women played in preserving knowledge, creating literature, and actively pursuing education, often within unexpected environments. It paints a monolithic picture of female ignorance, ignoring the varied realities of medieval education and literacy. However, historical evidence clearly demonstrates that many medieval women, particularly those from the upper classes and those in religious orders, were educated and often highly literate. While universal literacy for both men and women was not common in the Middle Ages, the idea that women were entirely uneducated is a significant misconception. Noblewomen, for example, often received an education that included reading, writing, Latin, and sometimes even French or other languages. This was not merely for leisure, it was practical. As managers of large households and estates, they needed to read and write letters, keep accounts, and understand legal documents. Early daughters of prominent families might be educated at home by tutors or sent to convents, which were often centers of learning for girls and women. Convents, in particular, played a crucial role in female education. And nuns and abbesses were often highly educated, spending their lives in study, copying manuscripts, and composing their own works. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, is a prime example. She wrote extensively on theology, medicine, botany, and composed numerous musical pieces, becoming one of the most prolific and respected intellectuals of her time. Her writings demonstrate a profound understanding of diverse subjects and a remarkable ability to articulate complex ideas. Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, wrote plays, poems, and historical works in Latin, making her one of the earliest known female dramatists in the Western world. These women were not exceptions, but representatives of a tradition of female scholarship within the monastic system. Beyond religious life, there were notable laywomen who were highly educated and contributed to literature and intellectual discourse. Christine de Pizan, a Venetian woman living in Paris in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, is arguably the most famous example. She was a professional writer, supporting herself and her family through her literary work. She wrote extensively on topics ranging from history and politics to morality and women's rights, including her influential work, The Book of the City of Ladies, which challenged misogynistic stereotypes and celebrated women's achievements. Her existence as a highly educated, self-supporting female author directly contradicts the fantasy of universal female illiteracy. Her presence at the court of King Charles VI and her engagement with leading intellectuals of her time highlight the opportunities available to some women. Even among the lower classes, while formal literacy was less common, women often had practical literacy skills necessary for daily life. Women in urban areas, particularly those involved in trade or crafts, might learn to read and write for business purposes, such as keeping records or managing transactions. Daughters of merchants or artisans might be taught basic literacy to help with family businesses. Cookbooks and household manuals from the later Middle Ages often show evidence of being written for and used by female readers. The widespread ownership of books, particularly books of hours and other devotional texts, also suggests a greater degree of female literacy than often assumed. These illuminated manuscripts were often commissioned for noblewomen, indicating that they were expected to be able to read them for their personal piety. The presence of female scribes and illuminators also attests to women's involvement in the production and dissemination of written materials. While education was certainly not universal for women, as it was not for men, the medieval period saw a significant number of educated and intellectual women who challenged the notion of female intellectual inferiority. Their contributions to literature, scholarship, and the preservation of knowledge are a testament to their active minds and access to learning, defying the simplistic narrative of widespread female ignorance.